All right, welcome to the Hosea 4 verse 6 podcast. I'm your host, Ivans, and I have a special guest today. Professor Karen Stern is an award-winning author who draws from the fields of archaeology, anthropology, history, and religion to research the daily lives and material cultures of Jews of the ancient Mediterranean, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. She earned a bachelor's in art in classics at Dartmouth College, a Ph.D. in religious study at Brown University, and has conducted field research in Greece, the Middle East, and North Africa with grants, fellowships, and residency from the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's an author of Inscribing Devotion and Death, Archaeological Evidence for a Jewish Population of North Africa. She also written Writing on the Wall, Graffiti, and the Forgotten Jews of Antiquity, winner of the Schnitzer Award. Did I say that right?
It's the Jordan Schnitzer Award. It's hard to say.
Award, yes. Schnitzer Book Award. And co-editor of With the Loyal You Show Yourself Loyal. Her current book project considers Jewish history through the census. The Daily Beast, Atlas, NPR, and The Guardian have featured her work. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's exciting to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. I have the book With the Loyal You Show Yourself Loyal. I read your part and other parts, and I was wondering, what did the title mean? I had an idea, but the idea that I had was, with the people that you hang out with who are loyal, you show yourself loyal. But can you correct me if I'm wrong?
Yeah, it's actually a biblical quotation, but that volume is it's called a Festschrift, which is a really catchy title, which is something in the academic biz that you do where former students of a scholar will create a volume, so an edited volume collecting works from former students of that person, so people who are in graduate schools or graduate school with that person, friends, colleagues, people who respect them. And this is a scholar who has done a lot of research on friendship and is very interested friendship in the Bible and loyalty in the Bible, which is so loyalty and friendship are really, I don't know if you remember from some of the classes you took with me, they're actually technical terms, right? It's not just about being loving or being kind. It's part of being sort of a contractual agreement where you sort of agree to engage in sort of reciprocal relationships, right? You give gifts, they give you gifts. If you're sort of threatened by an enemy, you band together. So for this scholar, who is a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, it sort of had a meaning, sort of a quotation, but also a meaning that was sort of substantial, if that makes sense, because he's always been a very good friend ever since he was my professor. He takes friendship very seriously and being good to your friends very seriously. So that was sort of like the double meaning of the title.
Oh, wow. Okay. That makes sense. Right. So it's basically a covenant, an agreement that individuals made with each other during the ancient times.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it can have sort of like a legal definition and strictly a legal definition, but often it's paired with other things. So perfect. See, you got that from him through and from elsewhere. Yeah.
That's what interests me about history, is little details like that, the unseen that makes the scene happen, because very few people consider the unseen with history. And that's the part of history that really gets me excited, is how does, before Christopher Columbus gets on a boat, what's the processes before he gets on the boat?
Right.
What's the processes of them making a Bible? What about history interests you that made you study it for so long and teach it?
Well, I think it's exactly the same thing that you're describing. There's a way in which, when we're little kids, we start to learn about the world, and there's certain things that spark our interest, right? But as you get older, you realize if you take the time, there's certain things that you sort of inherit, like people just tell you this is what happened in the past, right? And then when you study it, you realize it's actually more complicated and it's actually more interesting. And then you approach it again and the picture totally differs. It's sort of like before we were talking about teaching and the dynamics of teaching. And it's sort of that way. Every time you teach something, you learn more about the subject, both because you're sort of looking at the materials again and you're looking at the primary sources again, but also your students reveal the types of questions they ask, their advantages, change the picture entirely. So it's not something static, you know. I think people often imagine history to be sort of like a very finite, discrete topic, but it's something that's constantly changing and constantly reinvented and based on how you look at it. And that's what's really exciting to me.
You mentioned as you get older, like you start to see the picture start to come together, the puzzle come together. I realized that as I got older, the older folks that gave me advice, it started making more sense. Is that kind of like what history is? The more you get older, the more your experience in life, the more you could kind of like see history a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think so. And in that way, it's just a really good discipline over the durée, right?
Yeah.
It's something that, you know, I think when I was younger, I imagined that there were ways in which people sort of would like memorize a history book or something, like it was facts and dates. And I think this was sort of the traditional way that people used to study history, of course, right? Like when did these wars happen and when did these events take place? But it's the spaces between those events and dates and times. This is what you were describing before, right? That's what's sort of most interesting to me, right? It's not necessarily about the battle. It's why did the battle happen and did it affect people's lives afterward at all or not? Or so I think that sort of as you go along and you ask different questions about the same events, you go back and you look at it in a different way. You look at different types of information, and it's sort of like constantly reborn. Not that you're making it up each time, but it's just sort of more just the picture is fuller, maybe more kaleidoscopic or something like that. But that makes it exciting because you can never, it's sort of like asymptotic, right? Like you can never have a complete sense of what happened in the past. There just is too much we don't know. There are too many people who were incapable of writing or and recording their experiences, or they had houses or spaces that they constructed and they just sort of disappeared, right? So our data is faulty, but based on what we have, we can still sort of ask different questions and everything sort of is reborn anew, which is exciting, right?
Yeah.
It's not like a flat, static list of information. It's sort of people's lives woven together in lots of ways that if we want to, we can try to unravel or unpack.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing that you brought in mind was that not everybody had access to writing. I believe, like for most of history, 90% of the population was illiterate. So that just shows you that most of the story was told by the people who were literate, which was
Mhm.
usually the elite class, and usually the bottom
Mhm.
class were just more focused on work. Um,
Mhm.
is there a lesson from history that you learned from your research or your times teaching that you apply in your life?
Um, yeah, I mean, again, I think it has to do. It sounds like the same old thing of um, you just every time you approach something, you can learn something new, right? Like you never can know the full truth of something, even if it happened yesterday.
Yeah.
But if we sort of turn things over and ask different questions about it, whether it's an encounter with another person or an event that happens on the street, I don't know. We just learn different things. And I think it can teach us to be more patient with ourselves and with people around us. Um, and it can sort of undermine our confidence, right? Because we always know less than we think we know.
Mhm.
But my interest in history, and this is something that you were describing before, is I'm very interested in the people who couldn't write. I'm
Mhm.
very interested in the experiences of people who are sort of otherwise undocumented in history books. And so a lot of my efforts have been to see, can we use different types of evidence in new ways to try to explore those people's lives in ways that people have just said before, like, well, they didn't write, so we just don't know. Or they weren't literate, so how can we really know? Because it's that focus on a very limited understanding of literacy and a limited understanding of what counts as evidence that really blocks us. And I think when we sort of change how we look at things, and that's why I really like looking at a medium like graffiti, when we change how we look at it, we could say, actually, we can understand. We don't know what this person's favorite color was or what they ate for breakfast, but we might be able to understand how they felt about the people they loved, or how they prayed, or or other types of information that when we sort of unlock our expectations of what we're looking at, we can get a much fuller sense of the past, even from those people who are not sort of like writing diaries or something like that. So that again is really exciting to me. And those opportunities are there for sure. And that was sort of not really an answer to your question, but that is part of what makes it exciting. It's like a trick. It's like, how can I take this limited amount of evidence and work with it totally differently and ask questions totally differently to learn really new things about populations whose lives are otherwise unrecorded? And the methods of doing that, I mean, I feel like I use them in my day-to-day life, but it cautions us not to be too confident about what we think we know and what we can't know, right? If we just try, sometimes there's a lot more that's knowable if we just try and ask different questions than we're used to asking. So that to me is sort of what's a draw.
I feel like light bulbs are just popping up in my head. I feel like I'm in your class again.
Sorry.
So can we use laws, like laws that we know, like the Code of Hammurabi? The Bible has laws. Could we use laws to kind of piece together what the bottom classes' lives were? Or because we know that laws control behavior.
Yeah, we can in different ways. And you
Okay.
can, without like going straight to Foucault, we can try to figure, it's just the questions you ask of the laws. Okay. So we can go to laws and say, okay, you can go to the Code of Hammurabi and you get a sense not just of the punitive structure of society, right? If you do something bad, what is your punishment? But you get a very clear sense of the role that status plays in society, right? If a slave does something versus a wealthier person, what are the different punishments that they would then sustain? And so, so if we're thinking about laws as something punitive, which they aren't always, we can learn a lot about status and sort of inexactly about the word that we use as class. We can learn things like that too, right? What are the rules for men as opposed to women? What are the rules for free people as opposed to slaves? Do these laws seem to be equally applied? And then another really interesting question too is when we do have sort of sets of legal codes, but we also have an archaeological record, when do we know that there were laws, but then people weren't following those laws, right? So I think that's when we start to have a more complete picture of what's happening. And I'll just give you one example from my own research, right? There's a period of time in late antiquity when it becomes illegal to construct synagogues, right? In the Code of Justinian and following, right? It becomes illegal to construct synagogues around the ancient Mediterranean. But guess what? The majority of synagogues that we know were constructed in antiquity date to the exact periods of time that those laws were promulgated. So we know that law isn't everything, right? So it's important to give us insights into sort of governing structures and who has power, who uses power, who are the more advantaged and disadvantaged people in society, how those laws differently apply to them. But also, it's really useful to see an archaeological record where there's a question of what people are saying versus what people are doing. And we know in our day-to-day lives, I say all the time, right, to my kids, like, you'll be on the iPad for this amount of time. And then an hour after that, right, they're still there. So I'd sound like a really perfect parent, maybe, if you heard, my dialogue, but in practice, it's something else. And so that's what I think becomes richer. So I think the laws in lots of different ways can be really useful and meaningful, but also we can sort of test those laws and see to what degree they were being enforced, how they were being enforced, and whether people were listening or not, right? So that also shows us the limitations of power and the limitations of legal structures. So it's really different if we're talking about, Mesopotamia, or we're talking about the ancient Levant, or we're talking about sort of, Constantinople in late antiquity, or any other time, right? But that's what's important to remember, that not all laws were followed. And that's when it gets really interesting, right? When are people trying to subvert those laws, and how do we know? So long answer.
No, that's good. That's good. We just had a pandemic too, and I was teaching the kids about the Black Death, and a lot of the kids, what I realized is that they get subject to low quality information because of social media, because of the internet, and they get like they get these weird understandings of the pandemic. Oh, that somebody created it, or you know what I mean? Like, this doesn't happen in human spirit. But then when you go back in history and you see how pandemic started really because humans decided to join civilizations and to make a progressive decision to become civilization and build cities and live in close quarters. What is the importance of studying history for the modern times today?
Oh, I don't think history has ever been more important than it is right now.
Okay.
I personally, I view the act of teaching as, there are lots of different forms of activism in the world, to be sure, that are good and worthy. And I believe that right now the act of teaching history, just flat out, is a form of activism. There's a way in which, so there are a lot of different ways to unpack it. And I think what you're saying in terms of low quality of information and that sort of thing, that it's totally rampant. And I think there are two parts to that that are sort of interwoven. And the first part is the accessibility of the internet and the ways in which we can sort of harvest information really rapidly. And some of it isn't of good quality at all. I had a colleague this spring who just tried to test out researching a topic through Chat GPT, and half of the bibliography was totally made up. Like, these weren't sources. They followed like the form of a bibliography, and it was made up. So even these technologies that are designed to assist us are often lying. And so it sort of advocates in many ways the act of studying history in a formal way, so that people learn to think critically and to ask the right questions about the quality of their sources, how reliable they are. In many ways, every time we open a history book, if we're not looking at a primary source itself, we're engaging in an act of trust, right? Like, this scholar, I'm reading this book, they say it's true, so it's true, right? But if we're not going back to check, we're engaging in a type of trust fall, right? But the idea is, okay, well, maybe it was written by this person who had this graduate training, or this person who is teaching, and these are all the different reasons why I will choose to put my faith in that person. But the internet is something that flattens everything, right? People don't track down who the sources are. People can put in information anonymously that can go viral. And so I'm not sure if this is really two parts or it's many different parts. I think that teaching people, whether they're young people who are like 8 or 9 or 10, or they're 22 or 23 or 18, trying to encourage students to sort of look at the past in new ways, but think about how they put that past together and think about the quality of their sources is absolutely critical. Also, I mean, again, to go back to the just general AI internet stuff, I find that my students have very little conception of anything that happened before 2 years ago. Like, time is compressed. And I think that's partly because so much information comes from online, and there's something sort of just flattened about it, right? Whether something happened in 1350 or something happened in 1780 or it happened in 1970. For my students, that's all just old, it's all the same.
Yeah.
And I feel like because of the nature of our society, right? Like human age isn't valued as much, like information is old if it's 2 weeks old, all these different things, it all gets compressed into like the old stuff, right? But there's also at the same time a lot of efforts toward different types of activism, trying to think about how society should be organized, how what's fair, what's unjust. And in so many ways, I think that flattening leads to this other problem, is that students just don't even understand how historically sort of inequities in our society actually came to be, right? Why is it that these gender balances or imbalances appear in certain parts of the world and not others? Or, what is the cause of this economic inequity? But if you don't understand how problems were formed, you don't know how to resolve them, except with these like band-aid quick fixes. So the combination of all of those things, I think, is sort of explosive. And we owe it to our students to teach them how to learn about the past, to encourage them to do it, to learn how to do it. And for those students who are interested in making change for the future, encouraging them to see that they can't do that in like a substantive, positive way until they fully understand how the problems that are sort of endemic to our societies, how they got to be. And then they can start solving it, And so all of those things together, I think, are really powerful, but we owe it to our students because our society doesn't make it easy. It's not like somebody's like sitting by their grandparent always listening to stories about when they were younger and what they struggled with. That's not really encouraged, even just like in a family structure in lots of places today. So we have to like shake our students, not literally, of course, but just encourage them to realize that, the world wasn't created the day they were born. There's a lot happening beforehand. And if they don't like what they see around them, they have to dig in and dig back and look at how it came to be and then solve the problem and try, you know what I mean? Not like get mired in the past, but learn from it and learn with it and, change forward. So that's sort of, maybe that's not a direct answer to your question either,
It's
but
definitely,
that's sort of
definitely the right answer because it speaks to, because one of my elders told me, Prince Nat said that this generation deifies youth. And we've forgotten like the reason why we study the past is that our ancestors lived the life already that we're living today, and we can use those lessons that they learned from their experience to make better decisions in the present so that we can impact the future. So that's why when you say that teaching is an activist is an activist profession, it resonates with me because I know that me teaching 100 kids a day, that it might be a minute detail that they remember from my class that they could use when they're 20, with their 30, that could have an impact on 10 other people.
Right. And you don't even realize it when you're doing it, right? And sometimes when you're teaching, you're just trying to get through the day, right? And maybe some days teaching the history of the Paleolithic is amazing and some days not. But every time you're doing it, you're reminding your students that they are not the center of the universe. And I think that this is like the obsession with youth and the obsession with the sort of way of sort of curating your life with social media and this sort of, like, this is just going to make me sound really old and cranky, but I think it has like a really substantial effect of sort of creating humans who think the world just sort of like circulates around their head. And we know that it definitely doesn't bring wisdom, and it also definitely doesn't bring happiness. And so if we're going to look at those two things as sort of indices of what types of things make people feel like balanced and grounded and content when they're older, it's not doing it. I don't feel like, so in a way you're sort of like fighting the current, right? It's like walking like walking through the river the wrong way, and it's really exhausting. But I think just doing it with your students, like you're doing with your students, shows them why it's worth the effort, right? And it's all we can really do, I think, in so many ways, because we want our students to, move forward and have really successful lives.
Absolutely.
And sometimes we have to do things that make them uncomfortable, like remind them that, the world existed before them, and they have things to learn, and they don't like that, right? But it's worth it, I think.
That's actually one of my favorite quotes by Mark Twain. He says, "The world was here first. It doesn't owe you understanding."
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
So
right.
it's one of those things where, you're born in the present society and everything is already here. You have to operate under the rules and the statutes of what's already here and not your own.
That's right.
In the book, With the Loyal You Show Yourself Loyal, you mentioned Peter Saller, stating that there were women during the Roman times that were known as paterfamilias. Paterfamilias, I teach Roman time, but over the Roman time, are known as the head of the households, and that title is usually referred to men. For our audience, what was the importance of gender roles in history? Because we're seeing that this is not a traditional gender role.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about studying history, right, is that we have, again, we receive this way of understanding the past often, right? And it could be from our own classes or history books, where we imagine everything is sort of like backward, or like we've made all this progress in lots of ways, and there's so many times when you're studying history, you're like, wow, they got it more right, I think. And the Romans didn't get everything more right. I don't think that that's true necessarily, but I think when I was that particular piece, I was looking at ways in which it's very clear that women, whether it was in Roman society or in sort of Jewish communities within the Roman world, that women certainly played leadership roles that we don't necessarily accord to them. So that's not to say, again, that it was more progressive, but I think there are just certain received understandings about the past, like women were like this, or women. There are many interesting studies of extremely powerful Roman women, but the idea that women could be the head of a household, really, that's another type of example of sort of looking at the traditional evidence that we have and looking at it a little bit differently. And we could say, okay, there's like the word paterfamilias, it's like almost a colloquialism, even in English today, but understanding that women also, under certain circumstances, could be heads of households, and sort of by extension, that in certain contexts among Jewish populations in antiquity, the same thing could happen, even if in sort of modern, traditional Orthodox Jewish context today, that wouldn't necessarily be the case, or wouldn't necessarily not be the case either. It's complicated, but it's maybe something people wouldn't expect or sort of retroject, but that seems to be the case. So when we're studying gender or sexuality or anything like that, the most important thing is to be very like culturally specific. So if we're studying Rome during the Republic or Empire, it's different. If we're studying the Roman provinces, it's different. If we're studying sort of like early Christian micro communities or Jewish communities, it's also very different. But it allows but it's not uniform, right? Like we can't just say, oh, see, we see this example and now women were like the most powerful people, and that wasn't uniformly the case. But it really does change by the place and time, and so we just have to be very specific about it, just like we have to do in the world today, right? With our varied cultures and
absolutely
places. Yeah,
it's kind of like it's like the saying, like a true statement doesn't have to be true with every individual for it to be a true statement.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's right. No, I mean, I think again, that's what history is. It relativizes everything, and it's really annoying, right? Like we want to make these like grand sweeping statements all the time, And then you find one thing and you're like, yeah, except for that one. Oh, and except for that one. So it's like nobody likes it because it's not like neat little boxes. But again, in that piece, it was just really interesting that you have women like making these dedications to communal structures on behalf of their family, on behalf of servants in a household, on behalf, in ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect. So again, it's just how you, and that was from mosaics from a synagogue in Syria. And so it's just, I've looked at these inscriptions like a million times, and then you just look at it a little bit differently and you're like, wait a second. And then, a new world is created where it was sort of, nameless and faceless before. So, yeah.
So because I tell my kids all the time that you can make an argument that resources drive history, and the acquisition of resources, how to maintain resources, how to preserve it for the next generation. Because you wrote in the dedication that people would go and give donations to the temple, right? Because the temple is seen as a structure that's going to live longer than the human body. Does technology, resource, and environment dictate gender roles within a civilization from your studies?
I mean, yes. And I think that's a really useful way, I think, of framing it for your students too, because I think that's something that can really resonate with people, right? It's just not necessarily linear. It's not always how we expect it to be. But as you're saying, right, when we think about how, let's say, the temple in Jerusalem, when it stood, people think of, I don't know if people are to care to think back, maybe it's in religious context or something. So they think of it as being a religious structure, right? Whatever that really means. But it had its own personnel, right? It had priests and they needed to eat and get paid. And it was a place that brought pilgrims several times a year into Jerusalem, which brought money into Jerusalem. It brought money to the temple. And when I say money, I don't mean money like we understand it today, right? It's like animals and goods and all of these things. And I think that looking at those types of institutions from a practical perspective, right, as well as other types of perspectives, is really interesting because you're like, oh, these are people. These were the elites. They wanted the best food. This is how they got paid from these sacrifices. And when all these people were filtering through the city, they brought all these goods into the city, and that made the city sort of an economic engine of its time. And I think that's something that can really resonate with people. I mean, there's so many things we still don't know, right? So we can't fill in the picture entirely. But in terms of resources and preservation and just the idea that people needed to eat and how did they do it, and empires wanted their money and how did they get it and how did that impact people, I think it's a really useful way to frame it. And this is sort of what you were saying before. One of the great things about studying history is that it's not really a discipline. I mean, it is, of course it is, but it's sort of, you to study it in interesting ways, you need to sort of approach it from an economic angle, a political angle, a philosophical angle, a religious angle, from the benefits of studies in anthropology and sociology and all of it. And that's what makes it more exciting, I think. That it's not
the too.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. I just got all of these emails from students who took a visual history course that I taught, where we studied the Antikythera mechanism. And I have all these former students writing to me saying, because I guess I haven't seen the new Indiana Jones movie, but it sort of makes, and so they're like, oh, it's in the new Indiana Jones movie and I know what it is, right? But in order to understand, I mean, it's an analog computer, so you definitely need science, absolutely. Science, engineering, urban planning. I mean, all of these things are part of what makes the study of, let's say, ancient Mesopotamia so rich. So absolutely, it's all in there. It's not a single thing. It's not, but focusing on sort of the pragmatics of, resource management, how is society organized? Who is performing the labor? How are they forced to do that? How are taxes collected? These are sorts of things that if you can get your students to step back and think about, I think it does seem more resonant and human to them for sure. And it's great.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I took a trip to Mexico to see the pyramids in Mexico, and just seeing how large the infrastructure was. I was like, whoa, like it's a lot of work. That means that they had to feed them a lot. That's a lot of bricks. So now I'm thinking about day-to-day processes of like, okay, like I'm pretty sure somebody woke up and was like, I don't want to build this pyramid today, but they had to feed their family.
Right.
So we don't think about those nuances. And how does that affect, the relationship between men and women, right? Yeah.
For sure. I mean, that's the gender piece is for sure there, right? Who's performing the labor? What labor are they performing? One of the, and this doesn't have to do with Mexico, but a few years ago when I was starting to work on the graffiti project, I found this painted, like in the business, they call it a dipinto because it's painted, not engraved, from a hippodrome in Tyre. And there was like a menorah on it, and it said like, it was basically the place of Matrona. And I realized that people hadn't really written about, because